Right, next topic is race issues. A bit smaller this week than previous weeks, but some encouraging figures have emerged this week, and the usual stupidity still reigns in some places. Now, a new Associated Press poll finds that there has been a massive 15-point swing and that most Americans are now hostile to Black Lives Matter protests, all by design. And the poll from the Associated Press for Public Affairs Research finds that 44% of Americans disapprove of protests in response to police violence against Black Americans, while 39% approve. In June, 54% approved. The new survey was conducted September the 11th through 14th, and before Wednesday's announcement that a lone Louisville police officer would be charged in the Taylor case, but not for an actual death. Now, the figures are also interesting when broken down along racial lines. Just 35% of white Americans approve of the protests, which is down from 53% back in June. Latinos, 31% approve, compared with 44% in June. And support for BLM amongst African Americans has also dropped from 81% down to 63%. Big drop. The support for BLM amongst Republicans has also dropped from 29% to 9%. Meanwhile, 70% of Democrats still approve of the protests, while significantly more people on both sides of the political spectrum believe the demonstrations to be mostly or all violent. Now, the survey also finds that belief in the central underpinning narrative pushed by BLM that blacks are being indiscriminately targeted by police is now being eroded, which is exactly how the system wanted it to run. I told you all this when it all started. They're going to use the blacks as a protest, as a distraction, and then get the people to turn against the blacks for wrecking your towns and cities, and the cycle continues. So I'm pleased to see that all colours are now walking away from what's got nothing to do with BLM's narrative at all, and everything to do with divide and conquer and violence programs being ran on we the people by think tanks, agency clowns, and mainstream media, including Democrat Party leaders as well. Speaking of Louisville, which is where the Breonna Taylor case took place, which again we covered last week. You know, her boyfriend fired the first shot at the police officer. The media won't tell you that. They just won't. They're running a narrative and a program. But a Louisville university has cancelled all classes following the indictment of a police officer in the death of Breonna Taylor, telling white students to go and educate yourselves on systemic racism. Bellarmine University President Susan Donovan notified her students that classes were dismissed, a decision that was made after the hearing from many of our students of colour and their allies, and in consultation with faculty and student leaderships. Donovan said in a letter later writing, "The white members of our Bellarmine community to educate yourselves on systemic racism, recognise your part in it and work towards inclusion." and she urged her students to continue to channel your feelings into constructive action, such as pushing for police reform and exercising your right to vote for candidates who share your views about the fair and equitable treatment of all people. Oh dear. Do people not see that as actual, blatant racism? This university needs to be defunded until they learn basic common sense and quit running script programs of divide and conquer between the people. And that woman needs to be fired and charged in court for inciting violence. Misogyny could become a criminal offence in England and Wales to protect women, according to a report from the Law Commission. The independent body which is responsible for reviewing laws will look at whether those abusing women because of their gender should have tougher sentences. Currently, the groups and characteristics protected by law include race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity. And the Law Commission is calling for evidence from victims of hate crimes, police officers, prosecutors, and civil liberties groups, which will be assessed to help establish how misogyny hate crimes could work in practice. Oh dear. Whilst I don't condone that behaviour in any way, shape or form, clear guidelines will be required for this, as it will be open to massive abuse. A bit like the Baker Act. And why do we need laws anyway? Why can't we just be civil to each other? Next category is COVID-related nonsense, fake pandemic. And the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations said on Thursday that the US has created enough troubles for the world already, as the two nations continued to spar over the coronavirus pandemic during a tense meeting of the UN Security Council. And the US representative to the UN, Kelly Craft, criticised China over what she said was a decision to hide the origins of this virus, minimise its danger and suppress scientific cooperation. Let's take a step back a bit, shall we? If China was hiding it, it is because they are a part of the operations with Harvard University, the CIA, and Black Dragons involved in creating that operation. Fact. And Kraft claimed Beijing's actions transformed a local epidemic, it wasn't, into a global pandemic. It wasn't either. There's hardly any deaths around the alleged spread of the virus. And China's Zhang Jun swiftly rejected Kraft's characterization of events. Now again, this is not an accurate description. The fake pandemic was created in the EU, not China. It was the media and the European government and clowns who created the pandemic and we're all going to die. And the USA made it into Orwell 1984 on steroids, supported by non-thinking bot people. There was hardly any original event in China. It was contained within 2 weeks and hardly anyone died. That all gets lost in the rhetoric that carries on since. Xiang said, "I must say enough is enough. You have created enough troubles for the world already. Regrettably, we have once again heard noises from the US that are so at odds with the atmosphere of the meeting," and added that Beijing rejected the baseless accusations, and they're correct to do so. Now, the spat came 2 days after Donald Trump used much of his pre-recorded video address to the General Assembly to blame China for the COVID-19 pandemic and for withholding information about the virus. If you wanted to find out about the virus, go and ask Langley and Harvard first, Mr. Trump. Because if we in the alt media knows it, why don't you? Or are you just covering it up? Now, on Tuesday, Trump accused Beijing of allowing flights to leave China and infect the world, and referred to COVID-19 as the China virus on Tuesday. But it started in Harvard and various other research labs, one in California. On Thursday, Mr. Xiang said that the US only had itself to blame. Since January, the US has diagnosed more than 6 million. Oh, why not that figure again? Oh, dear me. 6 million coronavirus cases in its population and lost more than 200,000 lives to the illness. What utter rubbish that is. The figures were made up by the CDC and accentuated by the Langley-run Johns Hopkins Centre. Try less than 10,000 who died, and most of them were largely due to prior illness and age, of which certain governors like Cuomo killed a load in New York by sending infected people into care homes. Let's not forget that either. Now, the Russian representative at Thursday's session also criticised Kraft's accusations and said, "We regret the fact that the representative of the United States chose this meeting and the platform of the UN Security Council to make unfounded accusations against one of the members of our council." That was the Russian ambassador, Mr. Nebenzia. Now, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has repeatedly pleaded for unity between member states and warned on Thursday that the relationship between the US and China was moving in a very dangerous direction. Now, this is being implemented in the UK, and it's a heads-up warning to other states or other countries. It's called the 2020 National Security Number 973. And the document reads as such: the coronavirus, retention of fingerprints and DNA profiles in the interests of national security. Regulations 2020, which were made at 2:54 p.m. on the 10th of September. It went before Parliament at 4 p.m, 1 hour, 6 minutes later, on the same day, and is coming into force on the 1st of October. Retention of fingerprints and DNA profiles in the interests of national security. But it's funny how not just America, but Britain and many other countries' bills against the people are ran through within a single afternoon or session, and yet tax reforms or stimulus packages for the people take weeks, months, or not at all. Now, the Secretary of State makes the following regulations in exercise of the powers conferred by Section 24, Paragraph 2, 4 and 8 of the Coronavirus Act 2020. And in accordance with the Section 24, Paragraph 3 of the Act, considers that coronavirus is having or is likely to have an adverse effect on the capacity of persons responsible for making national security determinations to consider whether to make or renew national security determinations, and that it is in the interests of national security to retain the fingerprints or DNA profiles as provided for in these regulations. The Secretary of State has consulted the Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Material in accordance with Section 24, Paragraph 6 of the Act. In 2, the condition is that the fingerprints or DNA profiles are retained in accordance with a national security determination that will, ignoring the effect of these regulations, cease to have an effect on a date during the period that starts with 1st of October and ends with the 24th of March 2021. That is your second lockdown. Just saying. 6 months plus, they said. But it goes further. In 3, the retention of the fingerprints or DNA profiles under the National Security Determination may continue for a further period of 6 months, starting with the date on which the National Security Determination would otherwise have ceased to affect or ceased to have effect. 2, the first condition is that the fingerprints or DNA profiles are retained. A, under any of the following provisions. The first paragraph of Schedule 8 to the Terrorism Act 2000, Section 18A of the Terrorism Act 2008, and Schedule 6 to the Terrorism Prevention and Investigation Measures Act 2011. And also under the 63F Act of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. If the fingerprints or DNA profiles satisfy the national security retention condition. See Regulation 5. Mentions of why fingerprints or DNA are a national security issue in that whole document is 0. These are the questions people need to ask. Why are fingerprints and DNA a national security issue? Are they going to turn the virus into a terrorist? You may laugh, but these people are that stupid. And bot people just go along with it. So, given that bill, which was made at 2:54 p.m. on September the 10th, and went before Parliament at 4 p.m. on September the 10th, and it's coming into force today. 3 weeks. And then we come to this. House Democrats postponed a vote Wednesday on a $2.2 trillion stimulus bill in hopes a deal could be reached as negotiations drag on, with the White House on a plan to help Americans struggling from the impacts of the coronavirus. The vote was postponed until Thursday to allow non-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and White House negotiators more time to discuss a potential bipartisan deal, according to a Democratic aide who was unable to discuss internal deliberations publicly. Pelosi and Black Sun Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin met at the Capitol on Wednesday for their first in-person negotiations since August. So they've been arguing over this stimulus bill at least 2 months. Patriots Act didn't take that long, did it? The two sides have been at an impasse for months over the size and scope of a COVID-19 relief bill, but rank-and-file members have pressured congressional leaders to get some sort of relief done by Election Day. Of course, if they do it before Election Day, they will see it as Trump giving bribes to the people, and it's going to favour Republicans. And so the American people will miss out until after the election because the Democrats don't want to see the Republicans in favourable light. What an utter joke. But this is yet another delay in negotiations when it's relevant to giving money to the people. And yet 38 billion of Americans' money goes to Israel with barely a vote on it, or a discussion for that matter. And then our trustee decided that they didn't have enough with 38 billion and tried to send them another 130 million for PPEs. Again, all agreed practically on the spot. And when will Americans wake up to the fact that neither party are fit for purpose in regards to we the people? Here we go again, still on the COVID BS. A test that can diagnose COVID-19 in minutes will dramatically expand the capacity to detect cases in low and middle income countries. Oh my. According to the World Horror Organization. The $5 test could transform tracking of COVID-19 in less wealthy countries which have shortages of healthcare workers and laboratories. So the UK and the US are charging $150 to their residents, yet other countries is just $5. Okay. And a deal with manufacturers will provide 120 million tests over 6 months. And the WHO's head called it a major milestone. Lengthy gaps between taking a test and receiving the result have hampered many countries' attempts to control the spread of the virus. In some countries with high infection rates, including India and Mexico, experts have said that low testing rates are disguising the true spread of their outbreaks. It's funny they fail to mention that false positive testing figures are disguising the true bullshit of their claims. Funny that, isn't it? Now, the new highly portable and easy to use test will provide results in 20 to 30 minutes instead of hours or days, according to the World Horror Director. Drugs manufacturer Abbott and SD Biocenter have agreed with the charitable Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to produce 120 million of the tests, according to Mr. Tedros. Go figure, and no shit Sherlock. The man who couldn't solve viruses in his own computers, is now an expert in medical viruses, and the people don't question this. Bill Gates. And this deal covers 133 countries. You can say bye-bye to many of them, including many in Latin America, which is currently the region's hardest hit by the pandemic in terms of fatality and infection rates. Final piece before the music break is we're going to Australia and a full-scale update of what life is going on in Melbourne. And I want to say thanks to our THI member for taking the time to do this. I can't put it in every week, but if we get room, we will put it in. And over the last 10 days, he said, we have seen some interesting twists and turns for the fate of Melbourne and its inhabitants. Some liberties have been granted, while others have been taken back. There's been progress on legal matters. There are now 4 cases before the courts that each tackle a different element, not all, of orders by decree of the Premier of Victoria. Enforced curfew, freedom of trade and passage are the 2 lead cases before the courts, and the former is testing the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act 2006, and the latter is testing Section 92 of the Australian Constitution, and that's in the High Court. The first one's in the Supreme Court. Now, after a week of opening arguments for the Supreme Court challenge for the curfew, and on the day before arguments open, after 2 weeks of pre-trial, on Sunday, the 27th of September, the Premier, which is their president, announced the removal of the curfew effective at 5 a.m. on the 28th of September. The Victorian Chief Health Officer made reference to the appropriateness of the measure and made reference to the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and the Responsibilities Act of 2006. Now, both cases brought by individuals to the court, so kudos to them both for their efforts. Now, the hotel quarantine inquiry, we covered that when it first happened, and this is an update. It says this inquiry was a significant fixture in the news and pandemic because of contact tracing that has already failed. Claimed that every second wave SARS-CoV-2 case was linked to the botched quarantine of returning travellers and those inbound when the pandemic led to a lockdown of Australian and each state border, and empty city hotels were then turned into camps. Now, this inquiry heard its final witness, which is the Premier of Victoria, last Friday, and after the Premier's testimony under oath, it was clear to everyone that either Premier or all other ministers were lying about the quarantine failures, which was the reason for the inquiry. Now, the Premier then proceeded to blame his health minister throughout the proceedings. Let's throw everyone under the bus. And the above-mentioned references by the Victorian CHO highlighted that evidence was withheld from the judicial inquiry by someone, and the health minister, who was sold out on Friday, promptly resigned from Parliament on Saturday morning and threw several cats amongst the pigeons. I wonder do pigeons do curiosity? You can always try. And in addition, the contracts and all materials pertaining to the quarantine made their way into the public domain and proved the health minister told the truth throughout the last 4 months. And the inquiries into quarantine and identified specifically who knew and via due process who should also know. And what it did, it exposed the underbelly of government, aka the deep state. Now, it is widely understood the Premier is finished along with his party, and so too it may be that rusted on two-party politics is nearing its use-by date too. That two-party politics has not worked in any single country. Now, the police presence. There's been no protests that were organised, and none occurred in your traditional form. However, people have taken to writing messages on their masks, for example, #UnlockVictoria. Organised exercise now at 2 hours per day has seen nearly all of Melbourne out and about on the weekends for exercise and food shopping, and rendering all local walking trails overcrowded, although no one appears visibly concerned, and the smiles have returned. Despite no protests, the riot squad of the Victoria Police and their UN sidearm were out in force as a solution in search of a problem. The 15 to 20 black police vehicles in convoy are very obvious on empty streets. Their air support hasn't helped the situation either. Most police are either over the draconian measures, embarrassed, or simply no longer care. Most police out on the beat are all smiles and will engage is safe. There is a clear drive by the police to rebuild the faith lost in recent weeks, and a recognition that a lot of water must go under the bridge to win the public trust again. There have been fewer helicopters flying overhead and flying at higher altitude, fewer flights from China in the middle of the night, and it's been more than a week since I've seen an F-35 JSF at dusk in the area. When approached by police, the public is sincere but firm in their resolve and challenge every statement that does not make sense. I have witnessed 2 of these exchanges in recent days. The government has gone on a charm offensive. Our Federal Health Minister and new State Health Minister have maintained and engaged public appearances to only discuss the next Health Day or Awareness Week for the past 3 weeks now. I had no idea how many medical special research and fundraising days existed. Then again, this could just be a fundraising by stealth. Our part-time Prime Minister has dropped talk of vaccines and replaced it with talks of cures, be they a vaccine or antiviral drugs, and has highlighted existing legislation that prevents stockpiling of such cures. It didn't take long for the PM to be pushed by mainstream media and the social media about government's stockpiles of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, to name but 2. The government appears close to admitting the planned reversal of the ban of hydroxychloroquine for non-existent ailments, and the federal health authorities announced that their research had identified that people who suffered from dengue fever had little to no chance of catching SARS-CoV-2. The social media was quick to point out that the hydroxychloroquine, in combination with other over-the-counter medications, did cure dengue fever and left the patient's immune system primed to handle a SARS-CoV-2 infection, for example. So what is the word out on the street? Well, people are now able to congregate in small numbers, which is turning into medium-sized groups, and I've overheard all manner of conversations, and here are a few. A, it's those people in the shadows who want to give us the New World Order. B, everything has a 13 in it. The 13th star sign is. C, I guess they've been listening to our show. I am never voting for a major party again. D, why can I now go to the local pool and swim and yet I can't play golf? E. Do you know anyone who has tested positive? I don't. F. Who cares about the count of cases? It's total BS and a hoax. Get on board, mate. G. You should go and read up at the coviddoctorsnetwork.com because you sound so stupid saying that. So there are some of the comments out on the street now. And the COVID mortality has been from nursing homes for all 800 deaths except 15. And but for about 20 were all over the age of 70, and that leaves many annoyed. The 10,000 Australian dollar payments and doctors having their death certificates falsified has had a few laps of talkback radio too. Doctors were getting $10,000 payments for declaring death certificates with COVID-19 on it. And he said Melbourne might just be waking up as a village yet when the Premier mentioned his fear of a third wave coming at a recent press conference. It was met by laughter by the journalists and not taken seriously by anyone. Businesses have started preparing for an opening, and the air is no longer feeling heavy. Spring has finally sprung, and it's onward and upward from here. Great stuff, and thanks to our THI resident on the ground in Melbourne for that update. We'll be back shortly.